Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are located today. It is a great pleasure to share this space with you. On behalf of Parlaméricas, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for the invitation to moderate this session. For those who may not be familiar or as familiar, Parlaméricas is the institution that promotes dialogue and parliamentary diplomacy in the inter-American system, convening the 35 national parliaments of the Americas and the Caribbean. We are committed to improving and enhancing national and hemispheric democratic processes by fostering spaces of dialogue on key issues of common concern throughout the region, by facilitating parliamentary participation in multilateral fora, and by promoting legislative action and regional collaboration on work undertaken through our thematic networks. Currently, we have 3 permanent working networks to advance legislative action on gender equality, open parliament, and most importantly for today's session, climate change. Our mission within these networks, composed of and led by parliamentarians, is to strengthen the role of Parliament in these efforts and share experiences to face the challenges that our planet faces, such as the climate emergency we are currently in. We work through parliamentary diplomacy mechanisms because we understand that the challenges are complex and multidimensional, and therefore it is necessary to address them by seeking to build collective solutions, including through building multi-stakeholder partnerships with young leaders and civil society organizations. It has been made clear through the myriad of reports that have come out on the state of our environment that we need to act now to meet the climate goals of the Paris Agreement, the Aichi biodiversity targets, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the countless other environmental agreements. These are tremendous undertakings that not only require strengthened cooperation amongst countries, but also amongst diverse economic sectors and diverse stakeholders, especially from those populations that have been traditionally marginalized, which are often most vulnerable to the impacts of environmental degradation. If the pandemic and current world affairs have taught us anything, it is how interconnected our economic, social, and environmental systems are, and how we rely on each other to make effective decisions to ensure decision-making on these fronts are inclusive, holistically work towards improving social welfare, building resilience, and ensuring that we meet our responsibility as current stewards of the planet to live a clean and healthy world for our future generations. Inclusive participation in decision-making is crucially important. Our countries need to work to develop and implement increasingly ambitious measures for climate action, and these measures need to be developed through processes that involve citizens. Parliaments from across the Americas and the Caribbean are actively implementing and strengthening processes to ensure greater citizen participation in legislative processes. This is supported by Parlaméricas through our open parliament work, guided by the roadmap for legislative openness and related toolkit on citizen participation, both tools having been developed through co-creation between our member parliaments and civil society. All this to say, on behalf of Parlaméricas, it gives me great pleasure to be moderating this very important session of this conference on environmental democracy. Citizens need to be engaged in the discussions and contribute to the solutions for effective climate action. And today we have an expert panel that will dive into the trends and challenges related to participation in decision-making. So at this time, I would love to present our panelists joining us for this session. We have with us, since 2020, Birgitta Olsen has served as the National Democratic Institute's Director of Political Parties. She has over 20 years of experience as a leader at the national level in political parties, feminism, and foreign policy. As a former member of the Swedish Parliament, Minister for European Affairs and Democracy Issues, and board member for several democracy and development organizations. Welcome, Birgitta. The Honorable Edison Brose is a Panamanian politician, lawyer, and environmental and youth advocate, serving as a member of parliament in Panama since 2019. He is the head of the Independent Caucus and the president of the Panama-UK Interparliamentary Friendship Group, as well as holds many recognitions, including being named one of the youth's 30 changemakers worldwide by the Financial Times. Welcome, Diputado Brose. And we have with us Hannah Moet. campaign coordinator for the Forest and Environment Resource Network, known as FERN, has over 10 years experience campaigning for stronger energy, climate, and forest policies in European NGOs, and has published numerous reports and articles on finance and land rights, carbon trading, biodiversity, and offsetting negative emissions. She previously worked at Friends of the Earth and the Munden Project. And we do hope to have our fourth panelist join us, Mr. Augustin Niamchi, who is the Executive Secretary of Biosources Development and Conservations Program in Cameroon. I believe he's just a little bit delayed, so we hope he will join us. For more information on complete biographies of this esteemed panel, I'm sorry, perfect. Please, we invite you to visit the WFD conference site, and you can see more about our panelists there. So I guess without further ado, we'll just jump right into the dialogue. Colleagues, I've been asked by the organizers to keep us to our scheduled time. And so we're asking you to keep your responses to 5 minutes for each question. Our first round is a two-part question for two of our panelists, Brigitte Olsen and Diputado Brose. Brigitte, what is your impression about how access to decision-making on climate and environment is working these days? What trends and innovation do you observe?
Thank you so much, Alicia, and thank you, Westminster Foundation, in partnership with NDI and others for arranging this. And good afternoon here from Stockholm. And as mentioned, today it is actually, I think it's 2 years since I joined the NDI as the director for political parties. So it's fantastic to be here, kind of celebrating this. And I'm not sure if I will have some help. I have a few slides that I'm just going to walk through very, very kind of quickly. As mentioned before, my background is from party politics, both from being a former minister and a member of parliament for many years, but also being active in a youth wing and the women's wing of the Liberal Party of Sweden. And I could just say one thing for sure that I learned from politics when I was spending decades there was that democracies do it better, and that's also correct when we're discussing our topic of today, because we have no democracy without Democrats, as it's written on my coffee cup here, and we have no solution to climate change without Democrats, and that's why we need to support Democrats around the world to fight climate change. Next slide, please. As our dear NDI Chair, Secretary Albright, who dedicated her life to promote democracy and freedom around the world, and sadly left us last week, always used to say, democracy is fragile, but it's also resilient. And democratic political parties, what I've learned through the years, they need to be very resilient to solve the climate crisis, because there is no quick fix in this area. Next slide, please. So why do democracies do it better? Well, I say it's very important in this conversation today, I think, to really emphasize that we have a solid link between democratically elected politicians, democratic political parties, and environmental governance. We also know for sure that the investments that donors commit themselves to related to democracy, they're also very relevant for climate issues. And I'd like to just mention 3 things that I think is very important here. Of course, I mean, first, representative parliaments can hold governments accountable. We all know that. We know also that democracies guarantee higher levels of access to information and freedom of assembly. And this makes it easier for citizens to spread and access information on climate change, express their opinions, and mobilize people in movements demanding climate action. And of course, freedom of the press is key here. And lastly, democracies generally have higher levels of gender equality, which has been shown to influence climate policy. We've seen that women are not only leaders when it comes to the civil society organizations working on climate issues, but we also see in politics that quite a few women are paving the way and changing. Next slide, please, on my last one here. Staying inside my 5 minutes. It is a bit, however, easy to be pessimistic. We should not sound like Pollyanna here, but it's a bit pessimistic sometimes about the development nowadays. I mean, climate issues tend to be set aside when other global crises occur. And at the same time, we see that IPCC's most recent report makes clear that the window of opportunity is rapidly closing. Time is running short. So, well, political gridlock, partisan stalemate, and ideological tensions that goes years back. It isn't that far too often kind of the situation in the political landscapes of today's world. Lack of unity, lack of decisions, and they kind of tend to overshadow the real need for change. And I also would like to mention here the short-term focus of most democratic decision-making makes it hard to kind of adapt policy that would lead to the long-needed long-term change. But also on the positive side, to answer your question, I think also that we're witnessing something new happening, that climate issues can actually pave the way for a cross-party culture. And we see that political parties in a multi-party context, they are the backbone of democracy, and as such, they have an obligation to push for sustainable democratic development. And at NDI, we often speak of the importance of cross-party collaboration. That's one of my passions myself, to tackle the big issues in the world, to defend democracy and to deal with future and current pandemics, and to solve the climate crisis. We need to unite. And it's not an impossible task for one political party alone. And we've seen from NDI that our programming through the last years that kind of underscore the importance of approaching environmental sustainability through a multi-partisan lens. And I can reveal here from a current NDI program with global focus groups that cross-party work on democracy and climate is one of the most popular areas identified, especially among young politicians that we've been discussing, no matter ideology. And just to finalize a few specific examples. For example, NDI in Kosovo, we've been working on strengthening the issue-based caucuses in Kosovo's assembly. And this includes the Green Caucus, which works on a cross-party and inter-ethnic session to address environmental issues through fact-finding missions. And likewise in Tunisia, we have a group of MPs that have been concerned about environmental issues, and they formed this multi-party caucus, and it has achieved several kind of notable successes, including establishing the establishment of the constitutional body for sustainable development. And this body is something that you have, and it could be consulted about draft legislation relating to economic, social, and environmental issues, as well as development plans. So it's very key for the assembly itself. And also, last but not least, I would say one program that we're working on with my team at NDI, that's how to kind of connect informal youth movements to bridge the divide to formal political parties, which we think will be very critical for the youth climate movement. And political parties need to ask themselves, why are not the young global stars of the climate movement like Vanessa Nakate from Uganda or Greta Thunberg from Sweden, why are they not active in political parties? Why are they still being active in the civil society organizations? And this is interesting, and I think it leaves a lot up to parties to do this. And finally, in many countries, we see the trend of coalition governments where climate components and green parties are more common than just a few decades ago. And we've seen it, of course, in Germany, but also in countries like Belgium, New Zealand, Senegal, Austria, and many others. And that's really important to say. I'll stay there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brigitte. Diputado Brose, same question. What is your impression about how access to decision-making on climate and the environment is working these days? But I would also be grateful if you could share how the National Assembly of Panama maybe compares or contrasts with other parliaments in the hemisphere in this regard.
Thank you so much to everyone. It is a pleasure to share with you a little bit about our experience in Parliament and the challenges we've had. I would like to start saying what we have in Panama and ways people can participate into politics. And when I mean people, I mean civil society organizations and individuals. In Parliament, we have a space, we have an office that's called Citizens Participation Office, where individuals and organizations can push their ideas to become a law. For example, one can draft a bill, can introduce it to this office in Parliament, and if the bill has all the elements required for hosting it into a committee, then it can start the regular process. That's a way where some organizations can push legislation, and actually we've had successful legislation that has been passed and pushed by individuals out in the civil society without being members of Parliament. So that's one of the ways that we currently have here in Panama. Also, there's access through politics in order to participate and have influence over climate decisions. So as typically as in other countries, we have political parties, but we also have another path, which is called the independent path for people who are not affiliated in political parties. And I can speak for myself. I do not belong to any political party in Panama because I do not feel identified with them as far as now. But we have a process that allow individuals to collect signatures, and the 3 individuals with most signatures can be nominated into a ticket and then run for elections. My platform was an environmental platform, which had challenges here in Panama as everywhere in the world. But what I mean challenges is that many people really need to be more aware of the sense of urgency that we need to act now, be more aware of the cost of inaction and all the implications of not acting in time and not protecting our environment. I would like to refer to some of the processes we've had in Panama by pushing some of the legislations that I've pushed myself and have already become law. One of them is the single-use plastics ban in Panama. That's a law already. And then the e-mobility law, the electric mobility law that is actually a bill, but is soon to be ratified by the president and become a law. I would like to express some of the challenges in this process of decision-making. So bringing everyone together is definitely a challenge. To have all the stakeholders on the table to be discussing all the time, which is quite limited. One starts a discussion with people with contrasted interests, and you never know when that can end. And that's another challenge. I'm building some coalitions politically, coalitions with academics, coalitions with civil society groups in order to push laws and arrive at a common vision. And when I say I arrive at a common vision, I see how you can have experts on the table, but it doesn't mean you already have a common path, a common vision. Even experts see things differently. So that's why it is very important to be very persistent, to sit with all of them, to understand each other's viewpoints, and then arrive to conclusions. So building an ecosystem, it's one of the many challenges that we face by, for instance, raising awareness on the population on why these issues related to climate are important. How will that affect them? Why should members of parliament be working on environmental activism or environmental bills? So that's one of the challenges, to create an environment and to create a link with society and members of parliament, and for sure partnering with people from society in general. I will elaborate more about this experience on how we made it and the elements and tools we used to arrive to these important laws that have taken lots of time, taken lots of coalition, and show that it is possible to work in teams and get consensus over climate. I leave it there, and well, back to you, Alicia.
Thank you, Diputado Brose. Well, look, so we've started off our good discussion here. We're learning about the importance of political parties. We're looking at the importance of building coalitions across political spectrums. Some very interesting experience in Panama about how to use citizen participation offices or mechanisms within parliaments or political spaces to bring in the voice of citizens. But so I bring it back to Brigitte here, though, following up on your response. To the first question, how could access to decision-making be made better? What is needed? How could democracy support organizations such as NDI and others help? I pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Alicia. And very interesting to listen to my colleague here, also to have the experience from Panama. And that I just wanted to kind of share free, if I could have the first slide, please. Share kind of free takeaways that I wanted to kind of conclude this around, and connect to the work that we do at NDI. And I would say that it's so important to see kind of that we need to create more spaces for political parties to meet and discuss the climate issues. I mean, now I'm reflecting on both on the national level, obviously, and the municipal level, but also on the regional level and on the global level, because that is really missing today for political parties. And I think also in the world today, we have a very special moment right now. I mean, we have to unite around the multilateral perspectives on climate and democracy, and we have the Russian horrifying war and attack on the young democracy of Ukraine happening, and that has really shown why we need to unite to defend democracy. And I think a similar awareness will also be very crucial in the coming years when it comes to the link between climate change and democracy. So it's also a window of opportunity that people would really realize that why we need to unite more on this kind of big global issues. And second, one thing that I think is also key here to mention would also be that this is not only governmental business. Democratic political parties, they also need to unite, and we need to understand that cross-party collaboration is essential on all the different levels, as I mentioned, because right now we have a lot of cooperation and collaboration on the multilateral perspective when it comes to collaboration between governments, but not much between political parties. So that's something also we need to kind of change the attitude here. And also, lastly, I think it's not all about the money, but we need to invest more money in this sector and to see the links, because today, on a general basis, very little democracy aid is invested in political parties or the connection between political parties and climate work. And even if I have to admit that the democracy support in development aid has increased, I mean, steadily since the mid-90s, we do need more reforms. And also what we've seen, and I think this is also very linked and relevant for the debate on climate and democracy, that we need to be more kind of, democracy aid has been more historically successful in supporting democratization than preventing democratic backsliding. And right now we're facing both democratic backsliding and climate change. So that's also a kind of a combination that we need to focus more. But I'm also very hopeful to kind of end on that note, because I mean, what we've seen, I mean, with the Democracy Summit that started off in December last year, and now we have the Year of Action, and we have the new summit coming up later this year. I think we have amazing opportunities also to work on more on the kind of values-based investments. And talking about the values-based investment, I think what is happening very often when it comes to political parties and organizations on climate change issues connecting to democracy, that is very much about individuals that are pushing the agenda very strongly. I mean, I have to say we have it at NDI. It's very often a woman, and at NDI, her name is Lauren Meter, that initiated our AGAR network on climate and democracy. But it's so important to see that when we are increasing the democracy support on this, it's very important not only focusing and relying on individuals. We need to build that into the structure of the organizations to kind of make the real change here. And lastly, I just wanted to can I have the last slide, please? Wanted to quote my fellow Swede, Greta Thunberg. We know for sure that it might be cold outside for democracy, and it might be close to midnight for freedom. But I think having actors like her connecting the dots so clearly between fighting for environmental democracy and democracy itself, and identifying the links, and especially when young people are doing that, I think that would be a very kind of good foundation for the rest of us to follow. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Birgitta. And certainly, I mean, I just have to say, in terms of the idea of finding cross-party political support, we certainly understand the value of interparliamentary then at a regional and global level. And I know certainly we've worked closely with NDI and Westminster Foundation for Democracy, among others, and Globe to kind of make sure that we bring that voice and interparliamentary dialogue to the COP and other environments, because this also provides, parliaments are the space that have all of the parties. This is where you get cross-party support, and then to bring that to a regional level, I think is really, really powerful. Thank you so much, Birgitta, for that. We will be coming back to you later, so don't go anywhere. But I'm now going to turn to Diputado Brose and ask in a similar vein, how do you think access to decision-making could be made better? And how can Parliament, as a central institution for democracy, help? I pass it to you, sir.
I do agree, and strongly agree, that parliaments all over the region and the world are to work together. They should be working together. And I can also point out the example of the electric mobility bill here in Panama, how this idea came from a regional network of parliamentarians that work towards electric mobility. I participated in one of those meetings and heard best practices, heard that how this was a very evolving topic and tool to mitigate climate change. And that was like 2.5, 3 years ago. And that practice, that shared experience and listening to everyone's challenges, that helped us, that nurtured us and inspired us to start working. And now we are to have our first e-mobility law. That's still one of the first in the region. So I can point out a few things that I consider very important. One is educating legislators and politicians to better understand the multiplier effect and lead the cause. If the politicians don't understand the impacts of what they're pushing, then climate decisions will be harmed. Then some other interest groups will make their will stronger than the greater cause. Another thing that I think it's crucial is to explain the benefits and the cost of inaction, to explain it to the public, to the politicians, and then try to get some support. To build a stakeholder ecosystem, that is very important. People should be at the heart of policies. People should be at the heart of policies. We need to work with communities. Community knowledge is very important, and raising awareness among community, and then community organizations and links with parliament. That's a great tool to push the environmental agenda. Intergenerational dialogues to accelerate change. That is also one point that I want to highlight. And I want to finalize with some of the things we implemented in a process during 2.5 years to get these important legislations that actually clashed with many interest groups here in Panama, but we reached consensus. Some of the things we did some weekly meetings virtually, in person. We conducted public consultation. We used technology, Google Docs. We received some emails. We had a very friendly website so people had access to information more easily. We proactively we sought information and data information won't arrive by itself to the desk of the parliamentarians. We should invest time seeking that information and working across political parties, with the different caucuses and organizations to find out relevant information that can work to nurture what it's being promoted. We need to arrive to a common vision. As I mentioned earlier, we can have everyone on the table. We can have everyone sitting on the table with different ideas, and everyone can be an expert, but it doesn't mean they can arrive to a common vision. So it is important to understand each other and get agreements. Parliaments in general should be taken more into account when it comes to global discussions about climate. I'm used to seeing global discussions that take more into account the executive branch or some civil society organizations. I think we should use parliaments as a primary platform for open discussions, because everything that happens in the parliament gets filed within the legislative dossier, and it facilitates dialogue as well. And I would also say that being results oriented is something that helps to achieve climate goals, to know where we want to get, to understand that we need to listen to everyone, but we need to get to concrete results. And of course, we need to set a standard level of transparency. That's very important. Not accepting, some seductions from interest groups that always try to happen when it comes to important decisions that clash with some other people's interests. So to finalize, we are going through unprecedented time of disruption. So it is critical that we navigate this environment and create government policies that facilitate positive change and effectively improve the lives of our citizens. The necessary change takes time, and we all know that, but the time to act is now. So it's time to take action and ensure a prosperous and sustainable future for the different generations. So back to you, Alicia. Thank you.
Thank you, Diputado. Well, so lots to think about there, especially as we've learned a lot about discussed a lot about how to use politics and political avenues, political stakeholders, political parties, cross-party consensus, certainly parliaments. Of course, that's my passion as well, on how to advance this. And we thank the leadership of our politicians like Diputado Brose, who are bringing this forward. But this is where we have now to bring in Hannah Moet here from Fern, because Diputado Brose introduced us to this idea that very important for politicians, for parliamentarians, that there has to be decision-making has to access civil society, bring in the knowledge and the experiences of the people on the ground, of our citizens, grassroots organizations. And this is why, Hannah, we're so delighted to have you with us. Our next two questions are for you. Why is it important to ensure that participation in decision-making of grassroots CSOs to ensure better environmental and democratic outcomes? I pass the floor to you. This is your first question.
Thanks so much, Alicia. Let's see. I guess I want to start with the place where Birgitta took us to, and I want to drag us back there because I think it's important, and I think it's a really poignant time to be having this conversation. I'm based in Paris, in Europe. And Fern's board member was first contacted to be part of this panel on the 7th of February. And due to agenda clashes, she got in touch with me on the 7th of March and asked if I could replace her. And obviously what happened between the 7th of February and the 7th of March is of huge significance to a conversation about democracy, and casts really a dark spell over us all. Democracy, I think everyone here is going to agree, is really under attack everywhere we look, and we don't need to look far. In the UK, the police and crime bill would make it an offence, a criminal offence, to protest too loud, causing disruption. So when I look at the description of this event, and it says that in a democracy, all people should be able to take part in political life, we don't have to talk about Putin. We can look right on our doorstep. And this particular bill, which is undergoing discussion in the Lords and Commons, I mention it here because it actually has a really direct link with environmental democracy, because it's widely appreciated to be a direct response to peaceful civil disobedience aimed at increasing political pressure to act on climate change, as staged by Extinction Rebellion. Extinction Rebellion being a big movement in Europe and also globally to protest against inaction on climate change. And Extinction Rebellion is obviously a movement that results from the increasing urgency of the climate emergency. So I guess the question I'm asking myself is whether increasing environmental degradation is going to lead also to a closing down of environmental democracy, that the more we protest for climate change, against climate change, the more that space closes down. So that's nothing about Fern, but that's just a little bit like where I'm at right now with this question. So to come to Fern, so Fern is an NGO, as you rightly said, that works to ensure EU policies don't have a harmful impact on forests and forest people's rights. And we believe very strongly that an active civil society is super important, and that when we have the capacity and the means and the space to operate, the outcomes are definitely better for the environment. And Fern is based in Brussels, and that is blatantly true in Brussels because, as Edison has just said, the concentration, well, I guess the situation in Panama is maybe similar to in Brussels, but in Brussels, the concentration of industry lobbying is more profound than anywhere in the world. So it's important that we balance that out. At the same time, I think it's important that NGOs in Brussels don't think that they have all the solutions. So for this reason, we are, and I think part of the reason why Fern was invited to this panel is because we are continuously making efforts to open spaces in EU decision-making for our partners, who are mainly NGOs in highly forested countries, in Estonia, in France, in Finland, but also in Brazil and Indonesia and Ghana and Sweden, and not in Panama though, but that would be nice. So yeah, so we're always trying to open that space in for our partners, but more than only opening space to ensure our partners are heard in Brussels, we're really trying to influence EU policies to ensure that the policies themselves open space for civil society. It's quite a complex theory of change, but we want those policies themselves to open space for civil society, strengthen using sort of EU trade and aid levers as an incentive to strengthen environmental democracy. And that obviously works best when there is a strong interest from the producer country, like a strong trade link, like they export a lot of palm oil or a lot of soy or a lot of timber. And you can see it almost like a sort of non-commercial condition set by the EU for that relationship to exist. You have to include your civil society when you trade with the EU. And the most evident place where we have worked on that is in the EU's FLEGT regulation, which is a horrible acronym, but it's an excellent policy, and it stands for Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade. And as part of that policy, the EU invited countries to enter into a voluntary partnership agreement over the trade of legal timber. And Fern heavily influenced that and insisted the EU themselves insist that the definitions of legal timber need to be developed domestically in a multi-stakeholder way, and that the EU needs to provide aid to support the civil society in countries so that they not only have a seat at the table, but also a strong seat at the table. So yeah, those are some of the ways that we've been working in Brussels on that.
And Hannah, I mean, I think you one super interesting, and I myself look forward to learning a little bit more about the initiatives being undertaken in the EU. I think you spoke to it a little bit, but I do have a second question for you to give us some more concrete examples of where you've seen success in accessing decision-making spaces, but also some examples of ongoing challenges for participation. I pass it back to you.
Yeah, sure. So obviously this example of the multi-stakeholder timber dialogues has been a really important one for us. I think where I think it's been like super effective is in building a constituency of civil society that themselves feel motivated to hold their government to account because they finally have some space. I'm talking in contexts where often the space for civil society to operate right? Like sometimes in countries that are not democracies or like semi-democracies, so that they are motivated and feel safe to participate has been a really big outcome, and it's probably one of the most important sort of semi-lasting impacts of these voluntary partnership agreements. We're trying at the moment to apply the same logic to free trade agreements as also a place where two countries are negotiating, and therefore potentially a space where the EU has itself a space to say, hey, when you export to the EU, when you negotiate your free trade agreement, can you make sure that civil society are also included in that negotiation? But it's much more tricky, and I think it's tricky for three reasons. It's tricky because the trade stakes are much higher. So we're not just talking about timber, we're talking about the entire trading relationship between two countries. So there's much more reticence for governments to give up some power and have more multi-stakeholder sort of discussions around what should be in that trade agreement. And the culture of trade officials is generally much less open to civil society than the culture of environmental officials, and free trade agreements are really in the trade officials are in the driving seat, which is different with the voluntary partnership agreements. And also our partners are less involved themselves because trade is seen as an extremely indirect lever for them to increase environmental democracy. So they're actually much less keen to it's harder for us to work together also with our partners on that. So I think those are some of the challenges. I think in general, the last thing I would say is that what we are observing in the EU, and maybe Birgitta and has also some reflections, Birgitta and of course Edison as well, were some reflections on that, is that we're witnessing that governments in the EU are in a much more unilateral phase of their policy making. Possibly because environmental democracy is working, because environmental governments feel under pressure to go much faster and deeper on climate action, and therefore they don't want to wait so much to negotiate with other producer countries around, for example, whether it should or should not import goods that are linked to deforestation. That's the current thing that's on our table right now. But it definitely means that it's giving up that vision that we saw in the flagged action plan of using, and so we're less able to use the EU's sort of trade lever to be able to instigate environmental democratic reforms, governance reforms in country, in places where governance is maybe not so high, or where the link between government and civil society is not so strong. So yeah, we're seeing developments now which is really challenging that theory of change, and I think that's really something for us to think about more.
Thank you, Hannah. And while we're about to get to a point where we can have a bit more of a dialogue to see if there's some reflections from the other panelists, first, I do have the pleasure of bringing in our fourth panelist. We have, because I saw him turn on his camera, I suspect it's a bandwidth thing, and so he's turned it off a little bit. But if he could join us here, Augustine Jamshi, Executive Secretary of Bioresources Development and Conservation Program of Cameroon. Augustine, are you here with us?
Hello, Hannah. Thank you so very much.
Alicia, nice to see you, sorry. Augustine. Not a problem. Look, and because I didn't know, so I didn't give a full, like, I'm going to give it this short little bio. You have over 26 years of experience in the environmental and forest policy and governance advocacy field in Cameroon and the Central African sub-region. You have led or held several elected positions representing African civil society at the international level, and was the co-founder of the former chair of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. Currently, you're the coordinator for African Coalition for Sustainable Energy and Access. And we are so grateful to have you here and to kind of bring us a perspective from another part of the world that we've not yet sort of brought into this discussion. So I do have a question for you, sir. Let me just scroll down to my question. Can you speak a little about your experience in Cameroon and across the, they gave me the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance community of the challenges that CSOs encounter to participate in decision-making? I pass this to you, sir.
Thank you so very much. I tried to put 3 gadgets just to make sure that I participate effectively in this discussion, and none of them is working effectively. Those are some of the challenges we have in participating effectively in climate decision making in the part of the world where I come from. I live in the capital of a country, which is Cameroon, and I'm expected to have the best internet services, but you know, it has been very challenging for me. Thank you so very much. I think we consider this discussion very important, given the fact that those who are at the forefront of the impact of climate change are hardly ever getting a seat at the table, decision making, both at the national and international levels. This is partly because of our history, our colonial history. Environmental protection and decision making was brought in a way, in a kind of repressive way, ignoring our traditional ways and ways of life in living in harmony with our environment. So the issue that came up is that the colonial masters usually, you know, cut a portion of land to, like, say this is a protected area for their sports hunting and their loisir, as we call it in French, keeping the population away from it and criminalize even access to those spaces. And after independence, the African countries took this kind of culture of not consulting, not making participation a culture forward. I mean, the governments, the African governments that took place. It is only after the 1990s, the wave of change, or the wind of change that kind of shook the continent, that participative decision-making is fast becoming like reality on the continent. That said, our experience as a network, Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance is one of the largest, if not the largest, civil society movement on the continent that is advocating for climate justice, equity, and fairness, and justice in climate decision-making and environmental decision-making in general. So some of our experiences have been, you know, we came up with the idea of, rather than curse the darkness as civil society organizations, we should light the candle by participating effectively and contributing our bit in climate decision-making, both at the national and international level. We started by convincing our governments that they should not look at us as opposition parties. Whatever we are bringing on the table is for the good of the continent, because all of the decision makers have sisters, have mothers, have grandmothers that are impacted either directly or indirectly by climate change. And their politicians, their work will be easier if we have an environment that is free of climate injustice. This means those who are at the forefront of the impact of climate change, these are women who are those who are growing the food that we eat on our tables, those who are growing the food that they sell in the market to send our children to schools. If we have to take decisions about climate change without them having a seat at the table, it will be a decision that might not be very, very effective. Because these people are not only victims, they are also the solution to climate change. Take a patriarchal civil or village in the continent where the men dominate in decision making, but where the actions on the ground are expected from the women. If these women are not part of decision making, it will not be effective. And we have to remember that governance is not about the adequacy of the final decision, but it is more about the process of getting to that decision. So all the climate decision making, even the best decision that has been taken for the people, without the people, most of the time is generally against those people, with all the goodwill and all the good faith that is in place. So we want to introduce this kind of culture of consultation, participation in decision making, so that the people will take it as their own. So an example, Alicia, is when before going to Copenhagen in 2009, we went to villages with petitions. These women on the farm, these hunters, these fishermen, printing the petition that we need climate justice. We need a fair and equitable outcome in Copenhagen in 2009. But Copenhagen turned out to be what it was. When we came back, we were so frustrated. But did we have to stay back because we were frustrated? No, we had to go to the communities and report back. That is part of participation in decision making, because they know the return is very important for the communities. That we did not get the solution that we're expecting to have in Copenhagen, but we should not be shy of taking the bull by the horns and take decisions by ourselves to solve our local problems while waiting for international assistance or whatsoever that might not come. So on the 13th of February 2010, in one community in Cameroon, we got around 300 women representatives in one hall with parliamentarians, with local administration and traditional chiefs, just to get the results of Copenhagen and say, okay, let's put that aside. Let's look amongst ourselves. What are the impacts of climate change? How can we solve them locally? And then you would see, it's just that I didn't have the presentation on the screen, but I can send it to you later to distribute, because I never told you beforehand that I had this presentation. It would be very, very interesting. But the thing is, if you look at this, we got this the population to tell them what happened in Copenhagen, and again, give a space for these women to sit in the same hall with traditional rulers that they've never had the space to speak. And they took the front and took three major decisions. One, the mourning period for the bereaved has been reduced to basic minimum of 3 days. After that, people can go about their farm activities because the rainfall is very unpredictable. Two, those who have their goats and their animals that are led astray during the dry season are automatically expected to have control of their animals, so that dry season gardening for vegetables will continue to be an activity. Three, some water catchment areas were again expanded and protected so that they will always be having water, because one of the impacts of climate change is water scarcity. Those are things that the women would not have said if they were not given that space. So we did that, and it has been the business of PACTA to continue doing this climate governance thing as a principle. One, climate change discussion on this continent has been so elitist, so scientific, so technical, sometimes intentionally to keep the population away. What we've been doing is to demystify the concept of climate change and bring it to the ground for the effective participation of the population. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Augustine. But I do have a quick redirect follow-up question for you. Do you believe, or could you give us, in just within a few minutes here, how you think perhaps democracy support organizations, or even then if we have parliamentarians in parliaments, could help to kind of strengthen your ability to be more concrete in sort of the advocacy and work you're trying to do from civil society to access decision makers? Oh, perfect. Were you able to hear the question, sir? Oh, this is the beauty of Zoom.
Hello.
Hello, can you hear?
Yes, we can hear. I can hear you now.
Perfect.
I don't know where I went off, but please just remind me of any question.
Not a problem. I was just asking you a question. If you could think of, just to give a couple of ways that you might think concretely how democracy support organizations or even kind of work with parliaments, people could help facilitate a stronger, link for your work with decision makers. have you had a thought about if you were to ask? I mean, you have some democracy support organizations right here. So
yeah, one of the beauty about our organization, the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, and my home-based organization, BDC become, we have a culture of working with parliamentarians. The thing is to build the capacity of both access to information and participation demand from the demand side and the supply side. Who is supposed to supply the access to information and participation and even access to justice? It is the authorities that have the power. And it is not part of their DNA to think that access to information is a right or participation in decision-making is a right. The Aarhus Convention has not been ratified by many African countries. For instance, when we were currently we've been trying to put some kind of a drive on the continent to have a kind of convention on the continent. But, you know, signing those guidelines is one thing. Practicing them on the ground is very difficult. It is very challenging for someone to go to the Ministry of Environment or Ministry of Forestry or Ministry of Plan and ask for information and it's given for a local person. Probably when you are a foreigner, it is more, you have much more easy access. So that culture of not respecting the citizens has to be put aside. And this has to do with capacity building. Because at the end of the day, it's about capacity building for the government and the information keepers, holders, to supply the information in a proactive and efficient manner that it will be useful for the decision-making process. And then also build the capacity of the population to ask the right questions, the right time, and contribute effectively. I will just seize this opportunity and give you one example. We, in 2006, 2007, with the help of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the UK, we had this big initiative on the continent, the Access Initiative with the WRI. I had the opportunity to be the coordinator for Francophone Africa, and we installed that in many Francophone countries. And in Cameroon, where I come from, we build the capacity of local communities in oil exploring areas of the southwest coast to participate effectively in environmental decision-making, in this case, environmental impact assessment. Because it used to be like a checklist. The project promoters come, have a meeting in the hall with communities, and they just put their laptops up and then ask a few questions, talk, and go. But when we did this and developed a guide on community participation in environmental impact assessment, when they came for the next meeting, the villagers, the same villagers they've been dealing with for several decades, started asking questions that they could not answer because they were not prepared. They were not used to being asked technical or very pertinent questions. Those are some of the impacts, small impacts that we have with the work that we do. And in fact, we didn't have to be there. I read the newspaper while I was in Amsterdam for a meeting, whether at the Hague or a newsletter on the internet, that a community sends oil giant to the drawing board. And when I looked at it, it was that community in which we had this training. So if we continue to do such trainings, I tell you, the base, if the base is strong, and this is what we're asking for democracy institutions to help us to continue with this capacity building, both for the communities and for the government to understand that it is in the interest of all parties to make access to information and participation a culture, and that will help. Because the problem on this continent, Alicia, is not lack of resources, it's the governance around the resources. It's the governance around the resources. If we get this right, we'll be making a lot of progress. And so our demand, therefore, is for these institutions to help us to continue with capacity building and make participation or environmental democracy a culture in the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Augustine. Look, as always, so rich a dialogue, always press for time. I think I'm going to quickly, I had some questions. I'm going to put them off, open up to see if there's anybody in the audience who wanted to ask, because they've been listening, they've been inspired. So let me just see if I've got a question here. Climate, and so I'm just going to put this out to all of you. Climate change has appropriate effect on persons with disabilities, both directly and indirectly. Persons with disabilities are more likely to experience greater effects of climate change more when compared with those without disabilities. What can be done to cushion persons with disabilities? And this comes from Evelyn Amunga, Action Network for Disabled in Kenya. This actually ties into a question I would have had too, looking at just how are we ensuring when we talk about citizen participation and bringing those voices into decision making, that we're looking at it from the more marginalized persons in our communities who often don't have access to decision making and are more often disproportionately affected by the negative impacts of climate change. And so I think that goes together nicely with this question. I'd like to open it up. Brigitte, you're nodding. I'm going to pass it to you first, and then we'll,
Okay, yeah, I'll grab it. And thank you so much, Evelyn, for this excellent question. And if I remember correctly, I think it was in the Paris Agreement back in 2015. That was kind of Paris Accord. That was the first time when it was kind of very, including persons with disability, identified as one of the groups most acutely affected by climate change. So I think that was kind of a milestone, but a very late milestone to do that. And for me, and connecting to the work that we do at NDI, it's very much about giving people and preparing people for having a voice, because that's one of the major problems when it comes to historically and traditionally marginalized groups in our society on a global level. So I think that's one of the key things if we're linking to this discussion on democracy and climate. And we know for sure that persons with different disabilities, they are largely kind of excluded from decision-making process, both in parliaments, but also in civil society organizations. So that's also important to provide and support people having a voice. And one program that we're working on right now at NDI is actually about trying to create more of a toolbox for individuals in DPO organizations on how to approach political parties, no matter if it's around climate change issues or democracy or gender equality or other issues in society, but also how to be more stronger when they're interacting with political parties to make real change. So I think that's one of the things that I just wanted to highlight. And this discussion has been very late, like we know when it comes to marginalized groups, and not only when it comes to individuals with different disabilities, but also other marginalized groups. And that's very, very sad for the debate because they're very acutely affected by disasters of climate change.
Thank you, Brigitte. Diputado Brose, what do you, in terms of your perspectives on how to engage persons from marginalized groups, disability, into decision-making?
Well, definitely raising awareness is very, very important, not only raising awareness within civil society, but also within the political class. So the politicians understand what the challenges are, understand how these affect marginalized groups, people with disabilities, understand their feelings. If they don't have information, if they lack information, then they won't act. But if there is information, an organization to spur that information and to make some pressure on politicians, that can have an important effect. And I get that question pretty often when fighting against some things of the status quo. People ask me, what can we do? Well, I think people can keep track on their politicians, because what most politicians care about are votes. They care about votes. So if the electorate, if the constituents, they say, hey, these are our core issues. This is important for us. We're organized. We make pressure on politicians. Then many of them will listen, even the ones that don't listen, because, you know, it is as any country. We have people that care about civil society participation and people who actually care for themselves. But it is very important to raise awareness through organizing themselves, linking with civil society organizations, and putting up those important issues up into the top of mind, so politicians start acting on it.
Thank you, Diputado. And look, Hannah, I'm going to move to you next, but I just want to bring in, because we are for time, the next question sort of dovetails into this that I see there. Diputado Brose just sort of referenced it, but I want to get your perspective on it from civil society. How do you see the difference between bringing in individual everyday citizens, the example given, village women that Augustine talked about, and organized civil society, so organizations like Fern? Do you think there are pros, cons? When are they best deployed? Any thoughts welcome. This is a question from Rose from Berlin. I think Diputado Brose was just kind of recommending one of the ways is to get as individuals involved with organized civil society, because that allows for a pathway for engagement. Hannah, I turn to you to give a reflection maybe on the marginalized groups, but how you also see this idea of organized versus individuals engaging in decision-making.
Yeah, so I think that on the former question, I think that what I see as being really crucial is to really promote leadership from within the community. So I think that, you know, I think it so has been this idea that, you know, people can like properly represent the needs of people with different disabilities or different minority groups when they don't actually have a lived experience from that. So I really think it's very important to promote leadership and really support these people who are also excellent, you know, who also have excellent leaders within their communities as much as any other group in society, and really promote their leadership. So that's what I would say on that one. On sort of everyday citizens, like direct people from communities versus organized civil society, I mean, I think it's really, really important to see them as different things. And I also think that within organized civil society, there's also lots of different types. I mean, there are organizations that are more expert organizations. There are organizations that have direct links, that are membership-based organizations. There are organizations that have partnerships. So Fern is not a membership organization, but we have partnerships with organizations who themselves have a membership base in the country. So I think it's all about sort of like knowing the sort of the strengths and weaknesses and biases of each group. I think that, you know, just this idea that we can just bring, you know, we can just bring citizens to the table and then we will finally have the good solutions. I mean, obviously it's such a heterogeneous group. I mean, everyone wants something different. So I think, you know, that we have to sort of see all these different perspectives and then try and find the good way forward. Often civil society organizations are often issue based. So there'll be like a specific issue they're working on, whether it's women's rights or whether it's climate change or whether it's forest protection. So I think, yeah, they're just different things. But as much as possible, civil society organizations need to understand that they have their own limitations, and that they are not necessarily representing all people in society. They're representing a specific interest, which in Fern's case is forest protection, forest rights protection. And we try to, and I think the best civil society organizations really try to listen to what is happening on the ground, but they're not representing, they can't represent, and this comes back to the initial point I made, which is that you can't pretend to represent a group that you are not yourself from. That's just inauthentic, and I think we need to promote leadership there. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that one.
Thank you, Hannah. Augustine, I give to you to give your reflections on both of those questions. I'm asking you to do your best to keep it short because we're at the end here. Oh no, did you get the question, Augustine? No.
Yeah, come again, please.
Sure. Just your reflections, response to the questions about engaging marginalized groups. Specifically, the question was directed at disabilities, persons with disabilities, but then also kind of a little reflection on this concept of individuals versus organized civil society and accessing decision making.
Thank you. There is the issue of marginalization is generally with communities in the rural areas who are never there when the decisions are being taken on their behalf. And then within those communities, the women are again more impacted by the lack of access to information. And then within that group, the people with disabilities, and of course, in a community where disability sometimes is looked upon like the crime of the person that is suffering from that condition, they are even much more marginalized. So they are in triple jeopardy. And we think it is very, very important to take into consideration all of these people. First of all, making their communities accept them and know that they have a space, and to have that space is a right. I talked of capacity building. It is both way. It is vertical and horizontal, in the sense that as we are educating the decision makers there at the top, within the society itself, there's need for capacity building for everyone to understand that it is the right of every individual in a community, whether they have a disability or not, to participate in decision making. That is very important. Now, coming to organize civil society and individual organizations or individuals in communities, they play a complementary role. It is not either or. Those organized civil society organizations, especially in the North, have access to resources, funding, and even some knowledge that is needed by organized civil society and community-based organizations within the continent. So if all of these, all of these sectors are working together, it will be to the advantage of everybody. But of course, as we said, and as we have experienced, the bottom line is building the capacity of those on the ground to demand access and participation themselves, articulate their issues themselves, because we will not always be there to defend them or to talk on their behalf. When somebody is speaking from a felt needs basis, it is better than a quick fix. That sometimes we make the mistake, even us in Africa, we make the mistake of thinking that we speak for those people. Sometimes what we're articulating is not exactly what they want. So there's need for mutual respect and understanding, and know that the most important thing is to build the capacity of the people to articulate their issues themselves, not that they will always be doing it themselves. So I think that is how I see the approach to those questions.
Thank you so much, Augustine. Colleagues, I am so devastated because I actually have other questions that I would wanted to ask, and I actually would have loved to have heard your follow-up, but this is a conference and they have to move to the next session. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. I do want to reflect though, because one of my questions that we didn't get to, Augustine, thank you for bringing it in, because decision-making space is a space that does not, that lacks women. Unfortunately, continued in this way, women do not participate in the same numbers, especially in formal political decision-making spaces. And so I think it was so important that Augustine brought in the importance of getting those voices, bringing those voices into decision-making. And so that hopefully, I know that Brigitte would work on this herself through the work that they do at NDI. I certainly know in Panama, we have a project there, and among other countries, trying to really get more women involved in political spaces and entering politics formally. But ensuring that there's also systems to ensure that women's organizations, grassroots women's organizations, women who participate in civil society can feel that they have access to participating in those spaces freely and equally, because it is going to be such a valuable contribution. We also advocate a lot for getting more youth involved, because they likewise do not always get involved in formal political spaces. And so how can we create mechanisms for that? Again, Panama has a really interesting model for their youth parliament that would be worth exploring sometime at another event. I wish we could go on more. I learned so much. I'm very grateful to have been here with you all. But I've been told it's now time that they're going to have to shut us off. So I'm just going to smile and say thank you to everyone for listening. Such a pleasure to meet all of you. And until next time.